this episode of the AAF Exchange, the Supreme Court overturns President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, the latest read on the labor force and inflation, and Bidenomics. Joining us to discuss all of this, as always, is AAF's president, Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, how have you been?
I've been great. We had a nice 4th of July.
Yeah.
Hope everyone did, including everyone listening.
Yeah.
And now we're back to the most fun place on the planet, the American Action Forum.
Well, I spent mine golfing, so you knew I was ready to get back to the office on Wednesday.
That's just too horrible to endure for too long.
All right, so before we get into everything, everyone, of course, at the beginning of the podcast loves to hear your rant about something. So tell us what's on your mind.
In measured terms, I discuss policy issues, Kyle. I've just had it with the clean energy subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, which are always portrayed as the, quote, greatest investment in climate change policy ever. Hundreds of billions of dollars of good stuff. And the reality is they're not very good climate policy. They're highly inefficient. They weren't in any way designed to equalize the cost per abated greenhouse gases, which is like what a carbon tax would do, and very efficiently deal with climate. So we're going to waste a whole lot of money and not accomplish as much as we should. But most importantly, these are tax credits, which means they're reductions in taxes. And who gets them? Large corporations and rich people. So this is just a $100 billion tax cut for rich people and large corporations. And if anyone but the Biden administration had done it, that's exactly what you'd be hearing. But no. This is apple pie and motherhood and puppies, kittens, and sunshine
into climate change. Yeah, it really does seem like, that's and it also, didn't we go through this once before? Haven't we done this whole solar investment before with most of these?
We've had solar and wind production and investment tax credits for a long time.
Yeah,
and indeed, not long ago, we had reached an agreement with the various entities in the renewable space to phase them out.
Yeah.
And as a matter of tax policy, get rid of this unnecessary subsidy to them. Well, we have gone the other way. Let's just put it gently that way.
Interesting. And at the same time, we talk about good trade policy or good climate policy, but we still have these problems with tariffs, with the solar panels and all of that, right?
The whole climate policy is so internally inconsistent. I mean, we have tariffs on the solar panels, so we can't get as many as we'd like at prices we'd like. We have domestic content requirements on the EVs. We've got labor standards that raise the cost of all the installations. It doesn't make any sense. And the Chamber of Commerce just put out a nice piece that looked at what we know from the rulemaking on the electricity production sector and what they're expecting in the way of usage of EVs, and they don't line up at all. Like, there's not going to be enough electricity to hit their EV targets. So other than that, it's great.
Just as you said, American Pie and all the wonderful things.
I mean, this is as good as any kindergarten class could make it.
Well, let's move on to a topic that I know.
And that wasn't a rant. That was just a measured comment on policy.
Yes. Let's move on to another topic that I know you like to talk about, to have measured conversations of policy about. The Supreme Court overturned President Biden's plan for student loan forgiveness last week. You were on the road on the way to your vacation for 4th of July for this. You kindly pulled over and did a video on it for us. But would you remind everyone what the president had planned and what the Supreme Court ruled on?
So the plan was for individuals under $125,000 in income, couples under $250,000, you get $10,000 of student loans forgiven. Just stroke of a pen, it's gone. If you were also a Pell Grant recipient, it would be double, $20,000. And so this is, with the stroke of a pen, executive forgiveness of in the neighborhood of $400 billion worth of student loans over the next 10 years. That's the kind of thing that, is bigger than the CHIPS Act, for example. And so you might think Congress would have a say in that. So a couple things happened legally. Number one, some states sued because this would impair their higher education finance authorities. And the Supreme Court ruled they had standing to sue. That was a concern for a lot of people, that they would just say, look, there's no one here who's damaged by this, so there's no standing. They said, yes, there's standing. And at that point, they really said two things. Emphatically, they said the president, it's really the Secretary of Education via the executive order, the Secretary of Education does not have the legal authority to forgive these loans. They used the HEROES Act, passed in 2003, which was a higher education bill for folks who had served in Iran or Iraq and Afghanistan, and it was quite explicit about like the nature of the loans. The Higher Education Act was quite explicit about the nature of the loans. So Congress had said a lot of things about what the loans could look like, and it had never said you can forgive them, you can modify them, do things. So they just said, look, there's no authority there. You can't do this. Forget it. That was number one. Number two wasn't the major grounds for overturning, but much mention was made of this notion of a major questions doctrine, which if it's something is this large, the Congress should really weigh in on it. And so it buttressed that, which was an important argument earlier in the year. So, it's gone. Mm-hmm. The president was quite defiant in the aftermath of the decision that he would not stop. And indeed, they announced today that there's going to be a public hearing on the successor approach to student loan forgiveness. So they're right back at it.
Yeah. So you mentioned the administration, and they're already started moving forward those plans on, for an alternative plan for student loans. What's going on there? Do we have details on that yet, or are we just starting the ball on this?
There are no details. And just as a matter of, the way I think about things, if there was an easy route, they would have taken that. I think what we saw was the easiest route to forgiveness, and it failed. Yeah. So whatever they've got in mind has got to be even dicier. Yeah. Legally, especially.
Interesting. Well, you've mentioned that Congress should weigh in on this. Yes. Now that the program has been stopped, the ball is back in Congress's court, if you will. What happens next?
So I think Congress should weigh in on this. The administration is clearly trying to do something, and Congress should say, stop it, don't do that. Then Speaker Pelosi said quite clearly at the beginning of the Biden administration, he can't do that. Congress has to do that. Mm-hmm. And so this student loan program is a mess. Between the pandemic and the payment pauses and now these forgiveness and the variety of income-driven repayment plans that are out there, it's lost all coherence. So Congress should just, fix it. There is a bill called the FAIR Act, which House Republicans have drafted, and which I think has a chance of garnering enough bipartisan support to get through the House and Senate. It would leave in place the existing student loan program. So it's not like let's throw it out and go back to what we had before this direct loan program was invented. So it would just rationalize the direct loan program to have one repayment plan that's the standard one, and then an alternative income-driven for those who are having difficulty with their payments. So clean it up, get past the forgiveness, and move on.
Interesting.
That seems to me a sensible way to go.
Yeah, and before we move on to the economy, I just want to make mention for our listeners that Tom Lee has a great write-up on AAF's website right now about everything that's happened over the last 2 years with the student loan forgiveness.
Yes. Everything efforts. I know about the student loan forgiveness efforts I've stolen from Tom Lee, so you should just go read his stuff.
Fair enough. So let's move on to the economy. On Friday, BLS will release the June employment report.
Yep.
Many, including yourself, will be watching for signs of cooling in response to the Fed's inflation fighting efforts. So let me ask you, do you see the signs of cooling in the labor market?
I think the answer is yes, but they're not dramatic. Certainly, most people, when they look for tightness in the labor market, they go straight to the unemployment rate. It's at historic lows across lots of types of workers, so that doesn't look like, and it's stayed that way. So that hasn't happened. If you look underneath the unemployment rate, you're going to have both the supply and demand for labor. The supply hasn't moved much. We're still not back to pre-pandemic levels of labor force participation, especially among men, and so there's no slack coming from that side. So if you're going to get slack and cooling, it's going to have to come from the demand for labor. And my preferred way to look at that is to take the monthly employment report and look at what's called the index of aggregate payrolls, which tells you a combination of how many people are working, how many hours they're working, and what you're paying them per hour. And if you're willing to hire somebody, and you need them for a lot of hours, and you're willing to pay them a lot per hour, that's a lot of demand for labor. So I look at the growth of that. That's a crude proxy for labor demand. that peaked at well into double digits, 15% coming out of the pandemic. It was up at 8% entering this year, and it's now down to 6%. So it's cooled a lot in the past year, but it's not really cool.
Yeah.
So we'll see. And the employment reports have thrown us lots of curveballs.
Yeah,
over the past couple of months.
Today's report also, I mean, we talked a little bit of this about before we came on and started recording, this ADP report that's out today that, everyone's out there saying, the economy, the labor market's still strong. Everyone's pointing to that. It showed 497,000 jobs.
Yeah, big number.
Which was about double what they were expecting for last month. So you had some thoughts about this that I think it would be good for people to hear.
Yeah, so point number one is never believe 1 month's data on anything, but especially with this ADP report, be cautious. They re-engineered the ADP report last August. They used to try to predict what the BLS would have. They stopped doing that, and they just are putting out what they think is a fair estimate of job creation in the economy. So it's a new series. We don't know if they're getting the seasonal adjustment right and things like that. It's less than a year old. And I have some qualms about what I'm seeing in the details of this report. So we see 290-odd thousand jobs in leisure and hospitality. That looks a lot like a seasonal adjustment error. A lot of kids out of college working in resorts and things like that. That's a normal seasonal thing. Shouldn't count as sort of job growth in the normal sense. 40,000 manufacturing jobs lost. Don't know where that comes from. 90,000 construction jobs. Again, very weather related, subject to seasonal issues. So I guess the innards of the report make me nervous that top line isn't super reliable.
Interesting.
And we'll see.
Yeah. So speaking of inflation, last Friday, a lot happened last Friday for some reason. Yeah. We got the inflation report, which suggested a continued trend of progress of reducing inflation, albeit pretty slow progress. Where do we stand with all this?
So last Friday was the personal consumption expenditures price index, the Fed's preferred measure, as opposed to the CPI, which we're going to get on a different schedule. And if you look at the PCE price index without food and energy, so that's the core that gives you the best underlying measure of the trend, and you strip out especially the shelter part, where we just don't get observations of transactions very much. And so you look at the market-based PCE core. That's moved very little. It's down about 0.8% over the past year, and it's still more than twice the 2% target. Went down another 1/10 last month. So is the Fed making progress? Yes. When we hear them talk about the economy, though, what they continually say, and the Fed minutes came out yesterday for the most recent meeting, and those minutes had all observers who are never named, but they said, surprisingly strong economic data yet again. Mm-hmm. It indicated that some members did want to, in fact, raise at the last meeting. They paused. So I think this practically locks in a July increase, and today's ADP report has everyone losing their mind.
Yeah. So you expect coming up here in July, we're going to get another 25 basis points bump.
Interestingly, this is the third consecutive minutes in a row where the staff forecast has been,
I was going to bring up this.
We expect a recession, and despite that staff forecast, which is really saying you've done enough and it just hasn't taken effect yet, they're suggesting we haven't done enough. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the division in the Federal Open Market Committee. I don't think anyone thinks inflation's come down as quickly as they expected or enough, but some think they've done enough and it'll happen, and others think, no, we need to do more, and then have it come down later.
So do you think so they do really think that we're going to be having this July or this mid-year recession, or this later in the year recession, or is it into next year at this point?
The staff forecast is described as having the economy enter a mild recession in the fourth quarter, which continues in the first quarter of 2024, and then recovers. So, that's a pretty modest impact, and since with each one of these minutes being released, the economy's continued to be strong. they're closer and closer to saying, but we could be wrong. So,
always the hedging of the bets. Yeah. All right. So let's take a break for your favorite part of the podcast, the trivia part of the podcast.
Let's do it this way. I give you a number and you tell me what it's about.
Maybe in a future podcast when I've had time to study a little bit more and not just give you the curveballs. All right, so this will be a fill-in-the-blank one.
Okay.
This is one of your favorite topics on debt, the federal debt. According to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, debt held by the public will reach X percent of gross domestic product in 2053.
2053.
Yes, this was the fact of the day on Monday's dish.
Oh man, I never read those things. I'm a fact-free zone. 2053 long-term budget outlook. 143%.
181%.
Oh man, you sure that's not the alternative scenario?
This is right from as you can see, I have pulled up your daily dish on this one. It's right there. Wow.
So it won't.
Yeah.
The one thing we know is it won't.
Okay.
Because it can't. But this is what the larger role of the CBO, which is to be the budget scold and to remind everyone that we're on a trajectory that has to change, and thus make sure that it doesn't ever see 180.
Yeah, I mean it's an astonishing number, and I mean it just paints a very bleak picture for the budget situation, and it really seems that as you know we are getting close to a presidential election season. It doesn't really seem most people are talking about it, nor has Congress really taking a look at those big programs that they need to solve these issues.
I agree, and it's been quite frustrating to me personally for a number of years that this isn't being explained to the American people who need to know that we're in trouble and that things have to change, and then there's actual rational discussion of the kinds of changes that can be supported in Social Security and Medicare. You can't just run around and madly change this stuff without getting some buy-in by the beneficiaries and the future beneficiaries. So I think we're way behind the curve in dealing with this. Mm-hmm. No question about that in my mind. And I'm hoping that, there will be candidates who are willing to just stand down on, the culture wars and talk about the financial future of this country, because that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Finally, last week, let's move on to Bidenomics.
Yes.
Finally, last week, the President Biden unveiled his so-called Bidenomics plan. They had that one pager or that white paper about what was part of the Bidenomics plan. That he had that speech in Chicago. It was admittedly a little hard to follow at times. What did you take away from the president's speech?
So this is a transparent attempt to message success to the American people, and it's part of the campaign launch. And so, what do? Number one, you declare victory, and so they want to declare victory on what they've accomplished, and I think that's hard because they've got an economy that he inherited growing at 6.3%, growing at 2% at best. They have an economy that had 1.4% inflation that's now at 4.5% and coming down slowly. And the only people who really prospered in this time period are people who got EV tax credits and other preferred constituencies. It's a handout operation. So, and people, they don't get fooled. They know that. They're unhappy. Real wages are down, not up. They want to point to the low unemployment rate, and they want to point to the jobs, but the jobs are just part of the recovery from the pandemic, and the low unemployment rate is the flip side to the inflation.
Yeah.
It just, overstimulated the economy. So the record is not easy to defend, and they struggle to do it. So they pivot to, we have these principles, and you must agree that we should do smart investments, by which they mean government spending, and which is really hard for me to defend either, because CBO estimates that if you take $1 out of private investment and put it into the best government investments, you lose half the rate of return. How smart is that? Well, there's going to be situations where things are more important than just the rate of return, but that's not an endless list. So if you just focus on that, you're going to waste money. And their big accomplishment, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, is going to be a nothing burger. No one is going to notice that in the macro data. So that's one. Second thing they're going to do is they're going to empower employees and support them. That's just, we're the most pro-union administration in history, and that's problematic. If you're in a right-to-work state where job growth has been much higher than in the other states and they take away that right to work, how happy are you going to be?
Yeah.
So I think that's some issues there. And then finally, they want to, quote, promote competition. We've discussed their version of promoting competition, and competition should be about consumer welfare, meaning the American people and what they want.
Yep.
Their version of competition is we figure out who we want to win in these firm wars, and that's not going to help anyone. So I think analytically it doesn't hang together. I think the results have been disappointing at best, and so it's a tough sell.
Mm-hmm. It's the biggest bad mentality is unless you're our friends, like the solar subsidies, just to bring it full circle.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, you're a horrible, horrible threat to humanity if you're a large firm that isn't doing our climate agenda.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's not particularly deep.
One of the other points that they continuously hit on, and I just want to get this in before our time here, but was the fiscal responsibility part of this Bidenomics speech. I wanted to get you, they got...
So they continue to repeat the claim. They have the President of the United States, who did it in the State of the Union, who did it in this rollout speech, say, I have reduced the federal deficit by $1.7 trillion, the greatest deficit reduction of any president in history. And it is flatly false. He has proposed $5.6 trillion in additional spending. All that happened was not all of it passed, and the COVID emergency stuff lapsed. That's it. And you don't get to take credit for that. And a friendly ally, the Washington Post, gave him a bottomless Pinocchio for this, and they should stop it. It's embarrassing to him. It's embarrassing to the institution. Mm-hmm. You should have in president's speeches facts that are facts.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Doug, thanks for coming on and breaking this all down for us. I hope you have a good rest of your week and endure the heat that we are currently dealing with here in the city. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you.